So this is content related to disorders of childhood for abnormal psychology. So we're talking about neurodevelopmental disorders, so disorders that emerge during the developmental period, adolescence or sooner, or prenatally, and of course they have their roots in some sort of a neurological difference. So they would be manifest early as deficits in medical exams or screenings before elementary school. And they would have some sort of an impact on personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning. And they could be specific, like dyslexia, which is when letters appear to be reversed in the brain of the child, and other factors that impede reading and writing. Or general, like mental retardation or emotional problems associated with a range of conditions. There's a lot of overlap. So if someone, there's comorbidity. So if there is one disorder, there's likely to be another, like attentional disorders, ADHD, and learning disorders. In terms of the DSM, they, ones that occur specifically in childhood affect intellectual ability, like fetal alcohol syndrome, communication, like autism and tic disorders, emotion, like reactive attachment disorder, and behavior, like oppositional defiant disorder. And often adult diagnoses can be diagnosed in childhood, but they have specifiers like childhood onset depression, childhood onset bipolar disorder, phobias, anxiety, and very rarely schizophrenia can onset in childhood. Please make the distinction between a medical diagnosis and an educational diagnosis. When children are in school, sometimes there will be a referral that comes through the school that is seeking to get a child's support within the educational system because of some struggle that they're facing in the classroom. That would result in an educational diagnosis that might or might not be aligned with a medical diagnosis. A medical diagnosis would often be made at a very young age before birth, or it could be made at an older age. But the presence of one doesn't necessitate or prove the presence of the other. So an educational diagnosis, often during the school years by school personnel, generates support in the school through an individual education program and funded by federal and state funds that are designed for schools. Whereas medical would often made younger by a doctor or maybe a psychologist, depending on the diagnosis, sometimes made during school age, but that would be the parent taking the child to a doctor for a diagnosis or to a psychologist or psychiatrist. The result of a medical diagnosis would be like some sort of systemic support. So maybe their insurance, their own health insurance maybe would cover counseling or special educational services or something like that. So the school makes the decisions about what happens within the school, and the medical providers make decisions about what happens outside of the school. Some of the disorders we'll cover today include autism spectrum disorders, Williams syndrome, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, ADHD, reactive attachment disorders, learning disorders, and intellectual impairments. So children are particularly vulnerable to potential disorders because they're dependent on adults. So if the adults protect, this dependence is a benefit. If adults fail to protect, then this dependence puts them at risk. So they are really quite vulnerable. They don't have a stable view of themselves and their capacity to deal with problems, and a limited life experience, so life's up and down seem world-ending. And you can think of some of the first sort of traumatic experience that adolescents might go through as they reach puberty, and how devastating that can be, and without a perspective that allows them to take the broader picture and the realization that life just flows like that, sometimes that can really have quite a large effect. So the first that we'll cover is autism spectrum disorders, and this is quite an increasing diagnosis now. Characterized by social communication defects, and specifically we mean like things like sometimes the children are completely nonverbal, and we call autism a spectrum because there are ranges of severity We used to have quite a high-functioning name called Asperger syndrome, which is now out of date, but it really referred to children who might have an above-average intellectual ability in certain areas, but deficits in the social function and social communication. And that can go all the way down to someone who is nonverbal, is not speaking at all, can't make any eye contact, and seems to have some cognitive or intellectual delays as well. The difficulties would come in with social reciprocity, which means the back and forth of a normal communication or conversation. So this person, instead of when you say, hi, how are you, they might tend to respond with, hi, how are you, not recognizing that this is an engagement and they should have a dynamic in the moment response. There might be deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors, meaning that they're not understanding the subtle nuance of conversation. So a facial expression, a stern look from a parent might correct one child, but this child might not understand those nonverbal communication cues, or what we sometimes call the hidden rules. So the hidden rules of the classroom that tell what the social norms are. Like in this class, the rule says you shouldn't speak out of turn, but really it's okay to speak out of, they tend to be very rigid and not understanding those subtle nuances or what to do socially in terms of getting the ball at recess, that sort of thing. And so that leads to problems developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. They might also have restricted repetitive forms of behavior, like stereotypies, there should be an I there, which are repetitive movements. So in a severe case, this might mean often hand flapping is one. There's kind of a stimulation that needs to happen. Or even like banging head or spinning objects are often appealing and stress relieving for people with autism. In a higher functioning child, it might involve certain organizational structure, like lining up toys in a certain way very particularly, or having, as in bullet point 3, highly restricted fixated interests. Like I knew a child with autism whose fixation was maps, and all maps, even historical maps, and the child was very bright, and maps were a reward, like giving him the chance to study maps, his reward for engaging socially. And I knew another who was fixated with Dr. Seuss, and for many of them, just fixation on spinning objects, especially for lower functioning. They also will have difficulty with change, so they're going to insist on sameness. So in the classroom, a child with autism or on the spectrum might have difficulty if there's a substitute teacher, or if the schedule is going to change in some way, or if in the home, if the parent says we're going to leave at 6 o'clock and then they don't leave till 6:03, like that's going to be very stressful for this child. And then sometimes we have hypersensitivity to sensory input, meaning a sound that we can barely discern that doesn't bother us much might really grate on a child with autism. Or synesthesia, where stimulus through one sensory input, like through skin, say the child has a touch or a feeling on their skin, but they might experience it as auditory input, or the vice versa, so a crossing of sensory input. And maybe a heightened sensitivity to their feeling of their clothes on their skin, something like that. So we said Asperger, it's a little bit of an outdated term now, but these are pretty high functioning. You'll still hear this term used. High verbal ability, but not understanding of the hidden rules, like not understanding how long they should talk in a conversation. So they might take the floor a lot. Not having an easy time reading nonverbal signals, like, I'm getting tired, there you go, and not regulating emotion. And Rett syndrome, also a bit outdated, but this is a decline, like a child who advances normally and then declines and loses their ability to speak and so forth. So we have typically it's a doctor diagnosis rather than an educational diagnosis. So this happens often before school, and children with autism would be served in the schools with preschool education. A range of cases, a proportion of cases regress, like in Rett syndrome. And early markers would include things like at 6 months, this child isn't engaging through typical behaviors of big smiles and joyful expressions. reciprocal communication at about 9 months wouldn't be happening, and by this we mean the back and forth, like mama goes, "Ah," and the baby says the same thing, or mama mimicking the facial expressions, like mom goes, "Ah," and the baby goes, "Ah." Eye contact also is present as a challenge. These infants throughout this stage, and older children as well, would have difficulty making eye contact. 12 months, if we have a child who doesn't turn their head when their name is called, that might be an indicator. They wouldn't have social babbling, which is a type of linguistic communication that mimics the sound flow and rhythms of the home language. And reciprocal gestures, we could think of pat a cake, or give me 5, or waving bye-bye. 16 months, we might have a child who's nonverbal. 24 months, we might have an absence of 2-word phrases. And any time we have a loss of speech, babbling, or social skills, we would have a concern. So now we have 3 videos to show you, and I'm going to pull them over actually in our little links in our course here. So I linked up all the videos separately in case you'd be interested in watching them that way. So we're going to start down here with these early signs of autism. And this is a personal story from this man, but it's pretty good.
Are you driving? What a big kid.
Hi everyone, this is Alistair's dad. The most important thing to remember is just because some of these signs exist in your child, that doesn't mean an automatic diagnosis for autism. However, the more these behaviors occur in your child, the more concerned you should be. The key here is consistency and frequency of these behaviors. So in this first example, it's pretty obvious. Some children will hand flap during early development, but as with all these signs, pay attention to how long the behaviors last. If the child grows out of these behaviors, generally around 3 years of age, there's not much to worry about. But with someone like Alistair, who hand flaps every day, there is cause for concern. This is one example of self-stimulation, or stimming as it is called, and it helps to calm children with autism. This second example can be confusing to some, as most people have at least attempted to walk on their tippy toes at some point in their life. Again, pay attention to how often the child does the behavior. Our 9-year-old son, who was diagnosed with autism, still walks on his tippy toes to this very day. This third example may seem alarming. However, as long as they bang their head on something soft, like this padded high chair, generally they'll be okay. As a form of stimming, it can help calm the child due to the rocking motion. Many people with autism like to rock back and forth. We also show Alistair banging his head on the glass door and on the ground to show you different examples. However, after recording the footage, we promptly removed Alistair from the situation and redirected his attention to avoid any potential damage. Some people even need to buy football helmets for their kids, it gets so bad. This fourth example may not seem so odd to parents and others. After all, hasn't every kid been fussy in public at some point? But this behavior has less to do with not getting a treat or a toy, but due to the loud, bright conditions of most public settings. While it may be hard to distinguish sensory fussiness or meltdowns from common temper tantrums, an easy way to tell is this. When you give your child what they want, do they stop the bad behavior? If so, it's probably them just throwing a typical tantrum. However, if they continue to fuss, scream, and cry, as if in pain, even after they get what they want, then it's probably a sensory-related tantrum or meltdown, as most people call it. Although I don't recommend giving in to a child's demands, I think this exception can help once in a while, as it can be very revealing. Also, most common tantrums last minutes, whereas a sensory meltdown can last hours.
Buddy, I love you. Hard time. We'll get you home, okay?
In this fifth example, we see another example of stimming. While every child loves to play with water and blow bubbles in their milk, the key here is again, how long does this behavior last? Also, you may notice that your child is doing this behavior alone, withdrawn from others, instead of trying to put on a show. Generally, the behavior will last longer than 5 or 10 minutes and can last hours depending on the severity of autism. Look for extreme obsession and repetition with objects. And number 6, we have very aggressive behavior. All kids fight at some point. But is your child doing this immediately after being punished, as if they are enjoying it? It may seem odd, but this can be another form of stimulation, as they get a strong response from others when they are aggressive. You will notice the child being much more aggressive than a typical child for no obvious or good reason, like wanting something another child has, such as a toy.
Alistair, can you use your words? What do you think about the car wash?
At number 7, we have a lack of response to voice or sound. While every child has ignored their parents at some point, usually out of spite, you will notice an autistic child being aloof, as if in their own little world. Sometimes parents think their little child has hearing problems at first, but this has more to do with being withdrawn than not hearing. If anything, autistic people hear too much and have a hard time filtering out noises.
Alistair. Alistair. What are you playing with there, bud? Playing with a car? Sit down. Alistair. 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 Alistair.
Number 8 is probably the most well-known sign, and that's the lack of eye contact. Most people with autism will avoid eye contact whenever they can, and many describe it as painful. While the specific reasons can vary from person to person, this is definitely a strong sign that autism is present and usually persists into adulthood. Number 9 is missing speech milestones. If you don't know the general rule for how many words your baby or toddler should be using, then it's only a quick internet search away. Generally, if your child is only using a few words at age 3, there is cause for concern. If your child is 4 or 5 and is still not using basic sentences, there is a great cause for concern. Also, echoing words, or echolalia, is when they constantly repeat the same phrase, not in a learning way, but more like a broken record way, again and again and again. So be aware of that too.
Same thing for the past 20 minutes, right?
Finally, not all people with autism are nonverbal. Just because your child may be talking doesn't mean they're necessarily out of the woods. Number 10 has to do with problems in food or textures. Many people with autism are picky eaters, which ties into the sensory issues. Some hate the feeling of yogurt or dislike the food touching other food. While this sounds like typical child behavior, it's on a much higher level. If you offer that food to your child, even if they are clearly hungry, they won't eat it even to save their lives. Fortunately, our son Alistair passes this test mostly. He loves all kinds of foods. He is much more picky with textures like clothing tags and scratchy shirts. Our older boys who have been diagnosed with autism still love to wear their clothes inside out to avoid clothing tags or odd textures. Alistair loves the feel of flannel and likes to wear hats for the feeling of security it gives him. While we didn't get to cover all the signs and symptoms of autism, we hope this gets you started in the right direction. If you seriously think someone you love has autism, please reach out to a local psychologist, neurologist, social worker, or other professional. The sooner you get your child help, the greater chance they will have adapting to society and its many social customs.
Okay, so that is an overview of autism that I thought was pretty competent in terms of revealing the symptoms. Now, we have a few different mechanisms that underlie the process of autism, and I'm going to go through a couple more videos in a little bit. But first off, we do know that this was misdiagnosed early on. It was blamed on parents, particularly on mothers, who found this was based on original evidence by Dr. Connor, who noted that in 11 children that he had in this practice with autism, there was a lack of warmth between them. And he published his paper in 1943, and then Dr. Bettelheim publicized it even more broadly. But they found that that's not the relationship, that this is not based on parenting styles. If you look at those symptoms and think about a child who doesn't respond to you, isn't comforted by you, and doesn't make eye contact or engage in language, any lack of warmth might actually be exuding from the child and not from the parents, because of the reciprocal nature of communication. So no, there's no evidence for that. Is it caused by vaccines? This has been widely rumored because of a paper, the Wakefield paper, that looked at 12 children with autism who were in the clinic for stomach problems. They found similar stomach lesions in several cases, and so they were concerned that it was related to the vaccines because the symptoms seemed to come on in a time frame around the time they got that vaccination. They blamed it on thimerosal. We found that thimerosal was removed, and no rates, in fact, autism rates rose after thimerosal was removed from these vaccines, and there just doesn't seem to be any convincing evidence at all that the vaccines are causing autism. Is it caused by wheat gluten or dairy products? Some people suggest that these weak gastrointestinal symptoms or a leaky gut allow large molecules to leak into the bloodstream, and that gluten and dairy have opiate effects in the brain, and that children with autism are simply addicted, and that if we remove the gluten, we remove the addiction and improve the behavior. But we have no evidence for that either. However, some individuals might benefit from gluten and dairy, just like some non-autistic individuals might benefit. Is it caused by premature birth? We don't have evidence for that either. We know that premature infants are more susceptible to autism than full-term infants, but the risk for autism among preterm infants is less than the risk for other conditions. We know that preterm girls are at greater risk of autism than preterm boys, unlike later in life when more boys than girls are found to have autism. There's some evidence that people with autism have brain differences. We'll look at them. We know because it's common to have brain seizures and cognitive deficits, and the function of mirror neurons may contribute to this autism. And so we're going to look at a video about this in a moment. In fact, we'll look at it right now. So mirror neurons are neurons in your brain. Actually, I'm going to start with theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to understand others. This is a very short video, but it's relevant because in the mirror neuron video, he's going to talk about theory of mind. So when does an individual child become aware that he's separate and that his or her perspectives differ from the adults around them? This is the research on that.
There's a domain of developmental psychology called theory of mind, which involves basically asking how do we develop an understanding of other minds? How do we come to understand other people's thoughts, their relationship between their thoughts and their behaviors?
If you both want to do different things, what could you do?
How we reason about other minds in the world. We began addressing some of these questions with infants.
In this study, parents bring their 6-month-olds into the lab.
At the other side of a long table is a hill stage. A red circle guy with googly eyes tries to climb the hill. He sort of goes up the hill and then falls back down. He always fails at it. Then a blue square character, also with googly eyes, comes from the bottom of the hill and bumps him up to the top of the hill so that he's successful. On different trials, the climber tries again to get to the top of the hill, and then a yellow triangle character comes down from the top and bumps him to the bottom of the hill, so prevents him from getting his goal. Babies see this a number of times until they get nice and bored with it. So we stop and basically do a choice measure. Moms are asked to close their eyes. An experimenter who did not see which character was which brings over the two characters to the babies and just sees which character the baby touches first.
Which one do you want?
We found that, impressively actually, almost 100% of babies preferred the more positive character.
What do you want?
Okay.
So they seem to have an attraction to helpful, pro-social individuals, and also a real aversion to antisocial, unhelpful individuals. Babies are fascinated by the social world.
Hey, buddy.
Hey, hon.
Young babies are all about entering the social world, making connections with different social individuals, looking at the interconnections between different social individuals, and figuring out what that means. So I think these studies very nicely show how babies are evaluating individuals out in the world and how babies themselves are developing attitudes towards different individuals.
Okay, and I will add that in that study, they did change it up so that it was not always the blue square being the helpful one and the yellow triangle being the unhelpful one, but at times it was the reverse, where the yellow triangle was helpful and the blue square was unhelpful. And in that case, the infants chose the helpful one, regardless of which character it was. Now, as we look at mirror neurons, these are neurons in our brain that are linked to our interpretation of other people's our empathic interpretation of other people's behaviors. And so let's take a look at this rather nice little video explaining this.
Hello again. Gaze into a mirror, and what do you see? Well, I see my face, of course, but in my face I see moods, I see shifts of feeling. We humans are really good at reading faces and bodies, because if I can look at you and feel what you're feeling, I can learn from you, connect to you, I can love you. Empathy is one of our finer traits, and when it happens so easily, perhaps because, and this is brand new science, this is just out of the lab, we may have some special circuitry in our brains that helps us whenever we look at each other. Ask yourself, why do people get so involved, so deeply involved with such anguish, such pain, such nail-biting tension over football? We the Browns are gambling on defense. Why are we such suckers for sports? And it's not just sports. We can lose it completely at the movies, at video games, watching a dance. Is there something about humans particularly, that allows us to connect so deeply when we watch other people? Watch them moving, watch them playing, watch their faces. Well, as it happens, scientists have an explanation for this strange ability to connect. It's new. It had never been found on the cellular level before. A set of brain cells found on either side of the head. Among all the billions of long branching cells in our brain, these so-called mirror neurons have surprising power. What we have found is the mechanism that underlies something which is absolutely fundamental to the way that we see other people in the world. And it began entirely by accident at a laboratory in the lovely old city of Parma, Italy, where a group of brain researchers was working with monkeys. And they were testing a neuron, that's a brain cell, that always made this sound whenever the monkey would grab for a peanut. So the lab had all these peanuts around, and whenever the monkey made its move, the neuron would fire. Scientists thought, now here's a neuron that is essential to motion. It's a motor neuron. Then one day the monkey was just sitting around, not moving at all, just sitting, when a human scientist came into the lab, and when that scientist grasped the peanut, the monkey's cell fired. Now, the monkey hadn't moved. It was the human that moved, suggesting that this neuron up here couldn't tell the difference between seeing something and doing something. Seeing and doing were the same. Or more intriguingly, that for this neuron, watching somebody do something is just like doing it yourself. The head of the lab, Giacomo Rizzolatti, thought, wow.
The same neurons, one neuron, fire both when the monkey observes something and when the monkey is doing something. It's almost unbelievable.
It was surprising because this cell which was involved with motor planning for the monkey turned out to be interested in the movements of other people as well. Some people call them monkey see, monkey do neurons, but the name that stuck is mirror neurons, because with them, the brain seems to mirror the movements it sees. This accidental discovery got scientists thinking, doing more tests, and it soon became pretty clear that this is not just a monkey thing, it's a people thing too. We all know that humans learn by looking and copying. That's what infants do. First you look, then you do. And once you've watched and copied and learned a set of moves, you not only have them in your head,
You put your shoe on.
if you see somebody else doing it, you can share the experience. They know the moves, you know the moves, so you can move with them. If you can use the years of training that you yourself have done, learning to crawl, then learning to walk, then learning to eat, this is an incredibly rich set of knowledge that you can apply to the problem of actually seeing what's going on. So that's why when I head down this street carrying all of these packages, not only do people watch, look how they're watching. They feel my predicament. Because they know what it's like to carry heavy packages. They all know about carrying. So as they watch me moving, they can feel themselves moving. Their neurons are mirroring the action. These neurons may be the brain's way of translating what we see so we can relate to the world. The mirror system is the way that you tap into, the way that you harness your own abilities and project them out into the world. And people are really good at watching and translating what we see. Like with just 13 moving dots, that's all there are here, you'll have no trouble recognizing these very ordinary activities. What's more, tests have shown when a person sees a movie like this of his own movement, he'll recognize it immediately as his own. And that's why sports fans tense with the action and wince and leap, because if you know the game, then your neurons are firing as if it's you playing, giving a whole new meaning to the phrase armchair quarterback. That's why it's so easy to be a sports fan. But there is more, suggests UCLA professor Marco Iacoboni. He thinks mirror neurons tie us not just to other people's actions, but to other people's feelings.
So the idea was to try to figure out how the emotional system and this motor system are connected together.
Hello again. Gaze into a mirror.
Okay. Well, the section on autism appears to be cut off, which is unfortunate. I thought the video seemed a little shorter than usual. Well, the evidence that they were showing that we appear to be cut off of the video is evidence that children with autism tend to not pass basic theory of mind tests that are passed by much younger children. And that seems to be due to a deficit in their mirror neuron function. So they're not able to read other people as well as children without autism. So we will continue on, and I'm sorry that that was cut off for you. It's a shame. So just a couple things on treatment before we move forward. So how do we deal with treating people with autism? Well, the best thing that we can do is to interact with them. So we have to cause them to feel more comfort with doing those things that are uncomfortable for them through repeated social interaction when the child is happily engaged, not allowing them to back away and retreat into themselves, which is what their want is to do. So we can condition their desired responses using, say, a preferred repetitive activity as a reward, like the maps that I just described to you. But this treatment is much best if it begins as early as possible, even in the first year of life. And so that's why an early, even a tentative diagnosis would be beneficial for the child. So Williams syndrome I present right here, and it's of interest because it it is the opposite of autism in terms of the area of the brain that it's linked to. So first off, what is Williams syndrome? It has characteristics that are exactly the reverse of autism. The children tend to be kind, open, gentle, and trusting. They may have a low IQ, have difficulty solving problems, but no deficiencies in their social graces. They may never read or write, but they have a good vocabulary. Good storytellers, they love music, and they have particular facial features, as you'll see in these images. So I'm going to show you a video here about children with Williams syndrome, and then I'll tell you about the interesting linkage between Williams syndrome and autism. Oh no, here we have another trouble with video. And this isn't going to be good. We'll see if this is it, but
You think you can be born too friendly? I don't mean a baby who smiles a lot. I mean children who simply have no fear of strangers, who can't even imagine anyone ever wanting to do them harm. Meet some kids who I hope will fill your hearts the way they did ours. They're living with an extreme medical condition that is both a blessing and a curse.
Hey guys, this is the story.
Imagine a place nestled in the woods, where music fills the air, where you can dance to the beat of your own drum. And for some reason, everybody here wants to be your friend.
Hello, buddy. How are you?
Oh, thank you. Kids love to ask questions, but not as much as these kids.
My favorite color is blue. I have met Barney the dinosaur. I live in New York City. I do. I have two daughters and a son.
And kids love to make friends, but not like these kids.
I'm Italian.
They look a little different, but what makes them special is a rare condition called Williams syndrome. And here at a special camp in Michigan, these kids have gathered for a week of learning, fun, and togetherness. It may be the most welcoming environment in the world.
My favorite thing to do is come here and hang with my friends.
Who likes hugs?
I do.
When people give you a big, huge hug, you feel really loved. It's very nice to do to people.
The face that they like to put forward is that one of joy. As soon as you smile at them, you are their friend. You're no longer a stranger.
Terry Moncava started this camp back in 1994. Her 24-year-old son Ben, a camp counselor, was more than happy to give us a tour.
There's a lot of things you can do. There's like fishing, there's boating.
Williams syndrome is a genetic condition affecting 1 out of every 7,500 newborns. About 25 genes out of 25,000 are deleted in the middle of the 7th chromosome. That little genetic deletion creates a whole constellation of symptoms, including exaggerated, vaguely elfin features. The children also have hypersensitive hearing. That means, on one hand, noises like a parrot squawk can terrify them. On the other, they show a remarkable affinity and, in some cases, talent for music. Ben is an accomplished drummer. And whenever you're with Williams kids, put on the tune, because they are ready to get down. But by far, the most fascinating aspect of Williams is a complete lack of social inhibition.
I have a question to ask.
All right, let's hear it. What is it?
Do you like girls?
I do like girls.
It's like a friendship gene.
Yes, a little bit like that. We're trying to understand what are the underlying cognitive brain mechanisms that explain the social interests, the social exuberance that we see. Do you worry sometimes?
Dr. Helen Tager-Flusberg of Boston University has been studying Williams for almost 20 years. Like other researchers, she runs many of her experiments during the biennial conventions of the Williams Syndrome Association, which, as you can imagine, are rather spirited affairs. You might think all kids are this warm and open, but look at an experiment that proves otherwise. The tester pretends to hurt her knee. A normal 2-year-old does nothing and actually keeps her distance. The Williams kid does the complete opposite. Moves in, tries to comfort, even rubs his own belly in empathy. Just what I wish my kids would do. That hunger to help was evident when we met 8-year-old Ashlyn Baer.
I want to help everybody when they get sick or get hurt or if someone's feeling hurt.
So you're just you want to be a helper. Anybody.
Yes. Yes. Feels like an honor.
We aspire to have a little bit of Williams syndrome in all of us, and I think when you meet a person with Williams syndrome, it makes you think about how you respond to other people.
Look how 11-year-old Eva Stoll is drawn to every dog and every owner she sees. The inhibitions that I have naturally, they don't have.
Right.
But is that a blessing or a curse?
I don't know. I think it's more of a blessing. I really do.
I think it's the rest of us who have a disability. Because we don't know how to be as kind and as open as they do.
Well, wouldn't it be great if the whole world felt that way?
Chewy Pharmacy makes ordered prescriptions so easy.
Okay, and so the interesting thing about Williams syndrome is that it appears to have an overexpression on that particular genetic region is linked to autism, and an underexpression is linked to Williams syndrome, which suggests that they're flip sides of the same coin. Selective mutism is a disorder in which a child consistently declines or fails to speak in specific social situations in which they should speak, like at school, even though their language develops normally and they speak in other situations. And it would interfere with their educational or occupational achievement or with social communication. It would have to last at least 1 month, and it couldn't just be the first month of school because maybe the child is shy. It's not attributable to lack of knowledge or comfort with the language, and it's not better explained by like a speech disorder, like that might be more typical, an onset fluency disorder or aphasia. And it doesn't occur exclusively during autism spectrum disorder or schizophrenia or another disorder. So this is a child who just doesn't speak in that one situation. Moving on to impulsive or disruptive disorders. Here we have, the first of these is called Oppositional Defiant disorder. This child in the school system might have a diagnosis as well, and it might be the Oppositional Defiant disorder is the DSM diagnosis or the medical diagnosis, and in the school it might be called like emotional disturbance, emotional disability. But these child are the ones who are acting out in class, really negativistic, defiant, disobedient, hostile toward authority figures. They tend to make hostile attributions, assume that people are out to harm them, and it lasts for more than 6 months. So there are 3 types. The type 1 just tends to always be a little angry and irritable. They lose their temper, they're thin-skinned, they're easily offended, they seem angry and resentful. The second type is argumentative defiant and defiant behavior, so they're blaming other people, refusing to do things, arguing, trying to annoy, creating a lot of trouble in a classroom situation or a home situation. And the third kind are really vindictive. They ask out of spite, they're purposefully mean. If they think someone harmed them, which is an inference they would tend to make easily, they might deliberately say, pour glue into that person's lunch or something like that. So many children with oppositional defiant disorder go on to have conduct disorder, which we'll cover in a moment. We've already covered a little bit, but not all children with conduct disorder began with ODD. So conduct disorder usually emerges later, and it's this violation of rules and disregard for rights of others, so a violation of norms and rules, breaking the law, so to speak. It could include aggression to people or animals, like bullying people, threatening, fighting, using a weapon, being physically cruel to people or animals, stealing, or forcing others into sexual activity. Destruction of property is another aspect, fire setting or destroying property in other ways, vandalism or breaking things. Deceitfulness or theft, like breaking in or lying to obtain goods or favors or to avoid obligations. Stolen items of non-trivial value are characteristic of this rule violation. And serious violation of rules, like staying out past curfew, running away from home overnight more than once. So this is really the kind that people get into trouble for. So maybe they're starting to get arrest record or suspension records and that sort of thing. And the earlier this happens, the worse the prognosis is. So when these rule violations, sometimes these things can emerge in adolescence when people are testing their boundaries, and that emergence actually has a better prognosis than if it emerges in childhood. So we're just going to watch a very short little clip of this boy, and as you do that, you can think about maybe some of the factors that might be contributing to the phenomenon that's emerging. And here we come again.
Letarian Milton is not your typical 7-year-old. Few his age have ever driven an SUV up and down several busy streets. It all started at his mother's townhouse. Letarian says he took the car keys and hopped into his grandmother's Dodge Durango.
When I came through the back door, I looked on the counter, my keys were gone.
I took my gun come because I got mad at my mom, and then I saw him have my friend come in, and he smoked with cigarettes.
He started the vehicle and put it into gear.
I yanked the thing.
And off they went. Two 7-year-olds alone on the road. Letarian drove several miles through Lake Park in Palm Beach Gardens.
We got the one call that I told you about of the driver in the vehicle who looked too short to be able to see over the steering wheel.
Along the way, he ran over 2 mailboxes, hit 2 parked cars in a Costco parking lot, and struck 2 moving cars near Walmart.
I want to do it because it's fun. It's fun to do bad things. To drive into a car.
But did you know that you could perhaps kill somebody?
Yes, but I wanted to do hood stuff for my friend.
It all ended on Investment Lane and Consumer Drive. That's where the Letarian hit the curb and sideswiped the sign. The SUV took most of the beating, snapping off one of his axles and wheels. A grandmother's rage.
I want to whip his behind. That's what I want to do right now. If I thought they wouldn't take me to jail, I'd whip his behind right now.
You don't think he should be punished for all of this?
Just a little bit, no video games for a whole weekend.
And one unusual story for police.
Are you sorry? You understand that now your grandma's going to have to pay to have those cars fixed because you hit those cars.
Can my mom help her?
Okay. And so that is an example of, I think, a fairly early onset. And in this case, we may actually have somewhat of a benefit in this incident that happened because maybe he's going to get some help. And in cases consistently, the earlier the help emerges, the better. So we do tend to have some patterns that maybe you noticed, like you noticed maybe that corporal punishment was the grandmother's first course of action. And it's hard to know how much talking took place in the home, but we do often have these patterns that emerge. The child's disorder. First off, there's a genetic predisposition. So we have, often we find low verbal intelligence, meaning there's not a good vocabulary for expressing feelings. And so that results in an inability to really work through the consequences of behavior and a tendency to express needs through behaviors instead of words, whereas words are more socially acceptable and helpful and especially beneficial in school. Along with that, we might have minor, not serious, but neuropsychological problems like difficulty regulating emotion, meaning that the linkages that tamp down amygdala reactions as people develop aren't developing as normally in these children. And finally, a difficult temperament. A temperament is the personality a child is born with, and so this child might be of that difficult type, tending to be crying and active and have a negative kind of response to things even in infancy. And this combination of factors sets a stage for a kind of a tough child to parent. And so we have then, the kind of a back and forth play between parent and child, which can get kind of negative. So we have parents that's disrupted, and maybe the parents are coercive, and maybe there are some factors in them, and then the same responses in parents, and we'll look at this more in a moment. And these are some other factors that link to this. High-density family conflict, kind of lots of conflict within the family. Social isolation, so the family isn't embedded in a larger community that might help with some of these dynamics. There's not too many shared activities that parent and child or other people in the home enjoy doing together. They're not going on walks or playing a game or playing, they're not doing those kinds of shared activities. This child is going to have aggression to peers, and the peers are going to reject the child. So they're having sort of a rejection experience in some measure even since infancy, because it's hard to parent an infant with a difficult temperament. And then these other problems make those problems persist into school, where they experience more rejection. The child then isn't socialized well, has low self-esteem, doesn't feel good about himself or his work. The intellectual, the mild deficits can cause low academic functioning, and the teacher and child are conflicting in much the same way as the peers and the parents do. The parents may have low self-esteem also, not think much of themselves, and often parents who have difficult infants can blame themselves for that difficulty and not develop confidence in their parenting, a sense that they can't do it. And finally, they tend to have what we call a hostile attribution bias, which is they assume that people who act toward them in a neutral way are actually intending some sort of harm. So we have a kind of a pool of very difficult things to deal with. And the parent interaction cycles tend to be something like, well, the general coercive cycle is the child engages in the problem behavior, the parent, this is the general pattern, then we'll give you an example of it. The parent responds, and often with emotion, so the child is doing something and the parent responds and there's anger. And so then the child responds with anger in turn, and then the parent gets more angry, and then maybe the parent just gives up. And so an example might be the child refuses to clean the room. The parent yells at the child, so there's emotion there. The parent is reacting. And then the child reacts, maybe screams and throws a toy. Maybe the parent yells louder, screams and slams a door, and then gives up, stomp off, and the child doesn't clean the room. And a better alternative might be something like this. The child refuses to clean the room, and the child, remember, is difficult, so this isn't an easy child to parent. And instead of yelling, the parent breaks down the task, gives them a pathway to success, reinforces something positive that the child has done. Then the child might react well or might react poorly. One characteristic of children with oppositional defiant disorder is they don't necessarily try to please, so they may not react well to reinforcement. But regardless, the parent stays calm, in control, and objective, not blaming themselves and not giving in to that emotion that the child is playing. And then that parent just persists. And maybe the parent lightens things up, maybe even introduces some humor, and keeps on breaking down the task, and eventually the room is cleaned. This, rather than playing into the child's emotion, the parent is retaining in their own control and objectivity. Usually family treatment is best for conduct disorders and oppositional defiant disorder. So it addresses both the parents and the children. So if you think of the example we just had of the room cleaning, in the end the child won. They did not clean the room. And so that reinforced the child's behavior. And so then maybe that parent can use some help in learning a different way to respond to a situation like that. And this is not suggesting, again, that the parents are to blame. I mean, there can be some interplay at work, but the difficult temperaments are hard, and parents whose first child especially has that kind of temperament can blame themselves, and that really never developed confidence in their role as parents. A fast-track prevention program is the name of one program that has a good success record by training parents in behavior management skills and training children in social skills. Younger onset is worse prognosis, and the linkage is to antisocial personality disorder, which you'll remember from earlier content. 25 to 40% of those who have a younger onset, pre-adolescence, will eventually develop adult antisocial disorder, and more than 80% will have persistent social difficulties like in intimate relationships, friendships, jobs. Older onset, when conduct disorders, rule violations, getting into trouble, breaking windows, begins during adolescence, relatively few will go on to have adult disorders. They will outgrow it. Older onset people usually have fewer risk factors like low verbal IQ, so they're acting out as a part of their adolescent experience that does not persist into adulthood. We move on next into ADHD, and I will just leave this all in one lecture and maybe break it up later. It's a bit long. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. We can have attention deficit disorders with or without hyperactivity, and we can also have an inattentive variety. So the inattentive variety is difficulty getting in or sustaining attention, easily distracted, not listening, seeming not to listen or to remember instructions, not following through on responsibilities, difficulty organizing things, losing things, forgetting things, and disliking or avoiding tasks that require like sustained mental effort. The hyperactive variety would tend to have really hyperactive physical, motor activity, fidgeting, squirming, getting out of their seat, running, climbing when they shouldn't, on the go all the time like they have a motor, they're talking excessively, they're blurting out answers, and so forth. So I do have a couple of links for you to alternative treatments, and I will direct you to those videos without showing them in this lecture. But the very first, often that we use in our country, is to give children stimulants like Ritalin or Adderall, which tend to work because they stimulate the frontal cortex. Our frontal cortex, and in particular our prefrontal cortex, is responsible for our planning and prioritizing, all the organization things that children with attention deficit disorder struggle with. So if we stimulate the prefrontal cortex, they will better be able to regulate behavior, focus, and calm themselves. So that is one mechanism, but we do have another mechanism. It's called neurofeedback, and or biofeedback in the video, and it's derived from pilot training. And I'm also not going to show that video, but it's a very effective treatment, and I'll show you which videos you should watch just so that we don't have such a very long lecture right here. And this is the NASA clip. This is one variety of the NASA clip, and I believe I have another one in here too. I guess I don't. So we should have two varieties of the NASA video that would, let me see if it's in here actually, that should lead to, here we go. Here's the second example of that NASA training video that shows how you can actually retrain your own brain through a video game, and it's now actually FDA approved for treatment. And so if you have a child with ADD or you yourself struggle with it, this is a really nice example of self-directed neuroplasticity through the use of a video game. I encourage you to watch this. Now, I think I'm going to actually not cover the reactive attachment disorder because I feel like I'm getting too long in this lecture. So let's jump into intellectual disorders and the genetic and other underpinnings. So we start by just looking at what genetic conditions are. So we know that, let me see, let me go to a better place than that one. I'll go over that with you, but let me take it more in sequence. We're going to look at a few different conditions. Some are chromosomal abnormalities. In this class, we're going to look at Down syndrome in particular, and then some genetic conditions that can cause mental retardation or intellectual impairments are mutations on the genes, like Angelman's Prader-Willi syndrome, PKU, and Fragile X syndrome. So what do we mean by that? So mutations are copying errors in our, so we know we have DNA that have genes located on them, and we know that we have a chromosome, an allele that we get from our mom, allele that we get from our dad, and they are expressed or not expressed. But sometimes as they're copying themselves so that they can replicate in every cell of our body, a mistake can happen. And it's mistakes like inversions or translocations. And if these mistakes happen during development, then everything is impacted, and the proteins that are supposed to be dictated by this particular sequence of the genome is not functioning properly. So that can happen. It's a copying error. It can happen in the sperm or the egg that will become the gamete, that will become the eventual embryo and fetus and baby. Or we can have an egg or sperm that is simply wrong right from the get-go. So right when it goes through what we call the process of meiosis, where it halves itself in order to form half of a being that can, if it's an egg, it can eventually combine with a haploid cell, which is the sperm, which has only half the information. And in that case, we have 23 pairs of these chromosomes. each of these is an allele. This one's maybe from mom, this one's from dad. Each of them have the same genetic information, and the genetic information might be expressed from just one gene, whichever is dominant, and some genes, it can't be expressed if there's a dominant gene to override it. So sometimes a chromosomal abnormality will be a trisomy. Instead of just 2 alleles, this child got 3 alleles at the 21st chromosome location, and that results in Down syndrome. So, so a carrier is a person who has a recessive allele for a genetic trait or mutation but doesn't display that trait. So you might be a carrier for, say, a condition called Tay-Sachs disease. And so if we look at what this is a genetic profile of mom, of a gene. And so maybe the capital letter refers to a dominant allele, the lowercase letter refers to a recessive allele. The recessive allele will never speak as long as there's a dominant allele present. And so if you have this recessive allele, let's say it's for a dangerous condition, let's call it A disease. And so maybe you have this recessive allele for A disease. Maybe mom has that, and mom has this for her dominant allele. Dad has this dominant allele and this for the recessive allele. And in this combination, if this gets together, the first child maybe gets AA, 2 dominant genes, doesn't even carry that A disease. The second child doesn't have that disease because they have this nice dominant allele speaking, but they do carry this recessive gene, and if they pass this one on to their child could get the disease. And the same for this combination of these 2 parents. This last combination, AA, got this recessive gene for A disease and this recessive gene for A disease, and having no dominant gene to speak up, they will end up having this condition. So these are some more illustrations. This is not a course in genetics, so I won't go over it very much, but it might help you in understanding some of the conditions we're talking about. And of course, chromosomal abnormalities we've already talked about, and this is the case where they might get an extra allele from mom or from dad. So Down syndrome is a trisomy on the 21st chromosome, as we've talked about. It results in mental retardation and distinctive physical characteristics that include these particular eye formation, the epicanthal fold, like this. A widely spaced big toe, small ears, large polar creases and short fingers on the hands, and a tongue that has a lot of these grooves. So physical characteristics, but mental retardation in particular is the dominant characteristic. We also have a flat philtrum. The risk of that tends to go up with maternal age. That's because every egg or ova that a woman has began in her, formed it when she was maybe 3 months inside her mother's womb. Long before she was born, every egg was already formed. And so as she gets older, her eggs get older. They age with her body. Sperm are made throughout the lifetime of a man, so they're not as impacted by age. But the eggs get old, just like the woman's body gets old. And so as they get old, there are more likelihood of errors, to the point where she's pretty safe all the way up until around the age of 32, but then the risk of Down syndrome of a trisomy increases dramatically to 1 in 290. By 40, it's 1 in 100. By the age of 47, it's 1 in 46. We do have a couple more conditions that can occur in childhood related to extra genes or missing genes on the sex pairs. And we won't go into those conditions right now, but if you're interested, we can go over them at a later time. Mutations can occur, and they can occur with various things happen during meiosis or during mitosis, and they can be passed on, so they're heritable. And we won't talk about most of these, so we'll start with PKU, which is phenylketonuria, and all of you were probably tested for it at birth. And that's because it's a genetic disorder that can be altered by the environment. A child, it prevents a body from breaking down something called phenylalanine, which is found in milk and in manufactured food and drink products, like some diet sodas have it. And if you cannot remove phenylalanine, it builds up in the brain and changes the gene expression. So prevents normal brain development, prevents the production of melanin, which would cause coloration in the skin, so the child would tend to be lighter haired and blue-eyed, and have mental retardation. And that's only if they consume phenylalanine. As long as they don't consume any phenylalanine, they won't have this condition at all. So it's polygenic. That means it's on many genes. And infants usually undergo a simple blood test at birth to determine whether they have PKU. And if they have PKU, then they simply have to, all their lives, avoid anything with phenylalanine in it. And there are some lists of foods that a child would be provided. Angelman and Prader-Willi syndrome is interesting because they are both related to the 15th chromosome, but one condition emerges if the maternal allele is missing, another if the paternal allele is missing. So Angelman syndrome, and I have a nephew with Angelman syndrome. Both of them have mental retardation as a characteristic. But Angelman syndrome tends to have it used to be called laughing puppet syndrome because the children would often laugh. Like I know my brother would walk by and he'd stub his nose, ow! And that sudden action on the sudden burst on my brother's part would result in this child, laughing and laughing and laughing. You almost couldn't help but laugh with him. But we also have the hand flapping. We have sort of an excitability. In his case, there was a lot of difficulty sleeping. He's never spoken. He'll never walk. He's in a wheelchair at the age of 21. Prader-Willi syndrome also has the mental retardation, but it goes along with probably a dominant characteristic related to low muscle tone and an insatiable appetite. The mechanism that tells us when we're full doesn't work right in a child with Prader-Willi syndrome. So, two different disorders linked to the same chromosome pair. And this is Prader-Willi in adulthood if they're not receiving help in knowing when they should stop eating. Those are Angelman syndrome images. All that fair hair and that same big smile. Okay, and we could go through some of the testing that we have, but I think it's outside of our course, so I won't do that. And I will instead focus on critical periods and teratogens as our final material in this course. Teratogens are anything that can increase the chance of a birth defect, usually something in the environment that the mothers may be exposed to during their pregnancy. It can be prescription medications, street drugs, alcohol, chemicals or radiation, and an infection present in the mother during pregnancy. Critical periods are experience in the womb. So if we look at embryonic development, we can think of what they're exposed to having the greatest impact on whatever is developing at the time. So this is showing us weeks inside. The first 8 weeks are the most critical period because that's when all the major organs are developing. Teratogens that impact the developing embryo during this time frame will have the greatest impact on an organ and be most likely to cost a serious disability or the loss of the life of this developing embryo. So you can see that the central nervous system, actually let's start with the heart. The heart is developing, for example, up through the middle of the 6th week, and at that, because the heart is developing, it can be severely impacted here, and the impacts would not be as life-threatening here. The upper limbs are developing at this period, looks like about 3 to 5 weeks, and the impact is less severe here, but something that the mother is exposed to during this time might impact the upper limbs or the lower limbs at the same time frame. The eyes are developing here, and they continue to develop until the baby is born, which is why many infants who are born prematurely have their eyes not fully, they end up wearing glasses because their eyes didn't fully develop. And you can see how this is proceeding. The central nervous system, however, is going through major, and by this includes the brain, is going through major development, that is, neurons migrating to where they have to go, all the way up until the 16th week, and then continuing in more minor ways after that. So the development of things like ADHD or learning disabilities may be teratogens or some sort of exposure the mother had, unbeknownst to her, during the second half of the pregnancy, which, to orient yourself to this chart, right here is the first half of pregnancy. All this is the first half, and here is the second half. So we can think about the brain being highly influenced throughout the pregnancy. That's just another example of the same thing on a different chart. Let's continue on and look at a couple of teratogens that can be highly problematic. Here I am not going to show these, but thalidomide, I encourage you to watch it. I just have gotten too long here. Thalidomide is a medication for morning sickness that people in Europe took, in England in particular, in Germany. Mothers would take it early in pregnancy at the doctor's recommendation with every assurance that it would not harm them or their baby. You can see that it did harm their babies. It prevented the development of limbs, of ears, of essential parts of the development of that baby. It tended to be taken early in pregnancy when the mother was experiencing morning sickness as a way of limiting the morning sickness and helping her sleep. And the birth defects were quite severe. The video that I recommend you watch is this one. And it is in our file under teratogens. Let's see, let me pull it up here. It's under teratogens, and it goes over the history of teratogens of thalidomide, including the fact that it never did get approved in the U.S. So that is, it's an excellent video, and it looks at the challenge of this entire situation and maybe gives you a growing or an increased appreciation for our FDA and all the process that we've gone through in our current, here we go, teratogens. So the video that I recommend you watch is this one, The Shadow of Thalidomide. It's about 6 minutes long, and it will take you through the history of thalidomide and how that drug did not get approved. There's also some other videos that I'll share with you in a minute. Tobacco reduces oxygen flow. So because the baby is getting less oxygen, it's getting less nutrients as well, because the whole blood flow is being reduced to that baby. That's just one cigarette. And so what happens is we get this low birth weight. This baby just isn't getting the nutrients and oxygen that it needs to grow, and low birth weight is associated with poorer long-term outcomes. The placenta will change. The placenta is the organ that provides, through which the food and nutrients are given to the infant when it's in utero, and through which the waste is removed. So that is less healthy now. No longer is it functioning as it should. The fetus can die because of this. It is not getting the nutrients it needs. It's just not flourishing. We can have problems with delivery, like if the placenta, that organ, would cover the cervix, which is where the baby needs to come out of, or the placenta can separate too early. There again, the infant is threatened. We could have premature birth because the water, the sac of membranes that is holding the infant in place will rupture, leading to premature birth and an increased likelihood of sudden infant death syndrome. And this all comes from this deprivation of blood and oxygen that from this woman. Instead of filling her air with healthy lungs, she's filling her, instead of filling her lungs with healthy air, she's filling it with a carcinogen, with a harmful product that her baby is exposed to. So next we have alcohol. Fetal alcohol syndrome, 1 in 650 newborns are affected. Heavy drinkers especially seem to have the greatest impact, including low birth weight, brain abnormalities, facial abnormalities, like, again, this epicanthal fold, this flat philtrum is often an indicator, and then other characteristics as well, a small head, a small nasal, or small eyes, openings, underdeveloped jaw, and you can see the commonality of these characteristics in all of these images. The most severe impact is in the development, below average intelligence, mental retardation, difficulty regulating emotion because their brain just didn't develop adequately. The video right here, even though it's a little bit grainy, it really is worth watching because it covers both radiation, which is another teratogen, and it covers alcohol and compares the impact on the brain development with imagery of the brains. So I really do recommend it. Once again, I didn't show it in the lecture. Methamphetamine has damage at the chromosomal level that will result in limited growth. There's not enough room for it to grow, mental and physical deformities, and sometimes death. 50% of babies are delivered prematurely. Spontaneous abortion, called a miscarriage or premature birth, are common. Fetal stroke, as we impact the baby's blood pressure, and if they're born, lifelong challenges like increased risk of sudden infant death syndrome, low IQ, depression, anxiety, ADHD, type 2 diabetes, just a range of problems. Certain viruses can be teratogenic. German measles, one of the reasons that we all get vaccinated for it is because, not because of these flu symptoms lasting 2 or 3 days, mild sore throat and so forth, but because a woman exposed before 20 weeks can miscarry, or their child's eyes, ears, heart, or brain won't develop properly. It's rare, but it's important that people continue to get vaccinated to protect those unborn children. We recently had an experience with Zika virus, which hit home in particular to me because my daughter had a diagnosis of Zika virus after they traveled to Ecuador and after she had become pregnant and thought she was safe. Again, the symptoms are mild in adults, but it's neurotropic and it can really affect developing embryos with something we call microcephaly. The brain fails to develop, and you can just see this much smaller head on this infant. This video, that is also on our teratogens, shows a bit about the impact of Zika virus, and also another disease that can affect, mild disease that can affect developing infants. Lead poisoning is one that is still really much more common than we would want to see. I didn't know until I read a book recently that lead is the final breakdown product of uranium, and it's really problematic because it can lead to mental retardation, mental development, attention deficit disorder, cancer. This used to be in gasoline, but we still had lead paint that was used even up until, I believe, the 1980s. And so if you live in an older home where the paint might be old, even if it's painted over, it eventually chips off. And if children consume that, it slows their development. It's associated with 65 to 90% of the variation in violent crime rates. Of course, there are some like stomach pains and that sort of thing, but we also have learning disabilities, lethargy, and behavior problems. And so they use a chelation process to remove the lead from the body, and they also remove sources of lead. If it affects your child, the effects of it may not be reversible. And the final risk, I believe this is the final that I'm going to talk to you about, is radiation. And that's relevant. You know, we think of it as, well, let's just start by what it does. Radiation can cause damage to the cells, including the gametes, which are the reproductive cells that will form the eggs in the sperm. And it causes breaks or lesions in the cells. If you watch that video I showed you earlier, it'll show you exactly what happens, and it will lead to transcription errors, so we end up getting mutations. The body tries to repair the damaged DNA, But if it can't, those cells become dormant, they don't grow, or they kill themselves, they stop living, or we get cancer where the cells continue dividing out of control. And you could see some examples of all of this. And of course, we know about radiation that we might get during an X-ray, where we now protect ourselves with a lead vest because the radiation can't penetrate that. But other sources of radiation would include the uranium mines that were present when they were mining for uranium, or they used to even put radium in, people would work with radium in factories and sustain that damage, damage to themselves or damage to their cells, to their reproductive cells. So we'll just say radiation is a danger. Radiation can emerge from sources in nature, like inhaling yellow dust associated with uranium mining, or working with the products of uranium, like nuclear energy, if it's not cared for properly, and of course big releases of radiation through things like nuclear bombs or malfunctions of nuclear power plants. So that's the film that I am recommending. It's 12 minutes long, and I really encourage you to watch it. I did include Navajo neuropathy, which appears to be potentially having an impact by the uranium mines, and potentially a founder effect, a recessive gene that tends to be prevalent in the Navajo people because of the greater likelihood of marrying another Navajo who would also have that recessive gene. So among the Navajo, 1 in 1,600 births, but it's 5 times more common in the western part of the reservation than in the eastern part. And there's some suggestion that it has a genetic basis. It would result in some pretty serious problems, like even by an early childhood, we'd have this muscle atrophy, or these tight, hypertensed muscles. So the fingers would end up being claws, and the same thing in the toes. Poor weight gain, short stature, lack of sexual development, systemic infections, and usually death during childhood or young adulthood. Non-teratogens, things that aren't known to cause developing fetuses or embryos, spermicides. So if a woman didn't know she was pregnant and they used a spermicide, that's not thought to cause harm to a developing fetus. Acetaminophen, not linked to birth defects, if it's used as occasionally as recommended. Prenatal vitamins are helpful, not harmful, but certain supplements or extra vitamins can be toxic, so it's always advisable that you're very careful during a pregnancy. Microwave ovens use non-ionizing radiation like sunlight, which does not harm a fetus. So the last word here is that teratogens are any disease, drug, or environmental agent that can harm a developing fetus. Remember, they cause major structural damage during the embryonic period or the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. They can affect the developing brain, however, throughout the entire pregnancy, in major ways during the first half of the pregnancy, and in less major but still ways that might emerge in childhood later in the pregnancy. There's a dose-response relationship, meaning the more of the teratogen you're exposed to, the more damage will be done. But we don't know the threshold for damage because it differs by individual, and we also don't know individual genetic susceptibility. And finally, teratogens may exert their influence long after exposure, so you might not know at birth that your child's been exposed, but something may emerge during the school years or even in adulthood. That's the end of the content. Thanks for tuning in.